I want to begin this episode with something that most content in this space doesn't do. An honest acknowledgement of what we are doing. In episodes 1 through 3, we covered peer-reviewed research, clinical studies published in journals like the Lancet, verified perception cases investigated by skeptical researchers, the hard problem of consciousness is developed in academic philosophy, the quantum measurements problems as established in experimental physics. That was evidence, documented, reproducible, peer-reviewed evidence. I presented it as accurately as I could, including the objections and their limits. You can check the citations. You can read the studies. The evidence stands or falls on its own terms, regardless of who presents it. This episode is different. In this episode, we move from evidence to framework, not from evidence to more evidence. From the empirical record, what has been documented and verified, to a philosophical and theological tradition that offers an interpretation of that record. These are different kinds of claims, and intellectual honesty requires saying so directly. A framework is not the same thing as a finding. A theological tradition is not the same as a peer-reviewed study. Conviction, however seriously held, however carefully reasoned, is not the same as established fact. I'm going to present the divine mind framework in this episode because it is the framework I have been living inside of for decades, because it's a tradition that, in my judgment, offers the most coherent and complete account of what consciousness actually is, because it converges meaningfully with the evidence we have examined. I am going to present it as what it is: a framework, a serious philosophical and theological tradition with a sustained intellectual lineage, a lens through which the evidence can be interpreted, not as the conclusion the evidence forces, as the framework I have found most adequate to hold what the evidence suggests and what I have personally experienced. That distinction is important. Maintaining it is what keeps this series honest. With that said, let's examine what the divine mind tradition actually claims about consciousness and why these claims deserve serious engagement from anyone who has followed the evidence this far. A necessary distinction. Why frameworks are necessary. Point number 2, why frameworks are necessary. Before examining the divine mind framework specifically, I want to establish why any framework is necessary at all. Because there is a position that sounds rigorous, but is actually a refusal of thought. The position goes like this: I will only accept what peer-reviewed evidence established. I will not adopt any framework that goes beyond the evidence. I will remain in the space of what is empirically verified and not commit to any interpretation. That sounds like intellectual discipline. It isn't. And here's why. The evidence doesn't interpret itself. The NDE research established that a significant number of people report detailed conscious experiences during periods of clinical death, including verified perception of the external environment that resists conventional explanation. What does that mean? The evidence does not tell you. The evidence gives you the finding. What you do with the finding, how you integrate it into an understanding of what conscious is and what reality is like, requires a framework. The materialistic framework says these findings are anomalies that current science cannot yet explain, but that will eventually yield to conventional mechanism. The survival hypothesis says these findings are evidence that consciousness persists beyond the death of the physical body. The divine mind framework says these findings are consistent with the view that consciousness is primary, that is not produced by the physical, but expresses itself through the physical, and that what we call death is a transition in the mode of that expression rather than its termination. All three of these are frameworks. All three are interpretations of the same evidence. The materialist framework is not more scientific than the others simply because it is the default. It's a framework like others, one that makes claim beyond what the evidence strictly establishes. The question is not whether to have a framework. Everyone who thinks about this has a framework. The question is whether the framework you're working with is adequate to the evidence, whether it can hold the full complexity and what has been documented without forcing it into a predetermined shape. I have spent 54 years testing frameworks against my own experience and against the evidence I have examined. The divine mind framework is the one that has held, not because it makes everything comfortable. It doesn't. Because it's large enough to contain what I came back knowing at 7 years old, and honest enough to acknowledge that what it doesn't yet fully explain. Let's look at the divine mind tradition. The divine mind tradition is not a single institution or a single founder. It is a stream of thought, a coherent lineage of philosophical and theological inquiry that has been developing for well over a century in the American metaphysical tradition, and that draws on much older roots in Neoplatonic philosophy, German idealism, and the contemplative tradition of both East and West. Its central claim is simple to state and profound in its implication. Mind, consciousness, awareness, intelligence is not a product of matter. It is the ground of matter, not in the sense that individual human minds create physical reality through wishful thinking. That is a distortion of the tradition that has done its significant damage in popular culture. in the more precise philosophical sense that consciousness is ontologically primary, that the universe is not a collection of material objects that happen to produce consciousness in sufficiently complex arrangement, that it is, at its most fundamental level, a manifestation of intelligence of what the tradition calls divine mind, expressing itself through the forms and the structures we observe as physical reality. This is not an original claim to the American metaphysical tradition. It is a restatement in specifically American practical-oriented register of what the Vedantic tradition calls Brahman, what the Neoplatonic tradition calls the One, what the Christian mystical tradition calls the Logos, and what the Taoist tradition calls the Tao. The divine mind is the American branch of a very old tree. What distinguishes it from its antecedents is not its metaphysical core, that consciousness is primary, but its emphasis on the practical implication of that core for the individual human life. That is the distinction. If consciousness is primary, if divine mind is the ground of reality, then the human mind is not a local, isolated product of a biological accident. It is a particular expression of the universal consciousness, a specific individualization of the divine mind. And that changes everything about what healing is, what transformation is, what the mind's relationship to the body is, what death is. This is the tradition I encountered through UCTRUTH, the tradition that I have been living inside and studying at the doctoral level, the tradition that, in my judgment, offers the most coherent account of what I experienced at 7 years old and what I've been experiencing in the decades since. Point number 4, the 3 streams. Within the American divine mind tradition, there are 3 primary streams that deserves examination as related but distinct expression of the same metaphysical core. Stream number 1, Charles Fillmore and the Unity School of Christianity. Charles Fillmore founded the Unity movement in the late 19th century. Fillmore was a serious student of Vedantic philosophy, Christian Science, Theosophy, and the New Thought movement. And he synthesized these influences into a specifically Christian metaphysical framework. His central contribution was the development of what he called the 12 powers of the soul, a systematic account of human faculties understood as specific individualizations of divine attributes: faith, strength, wisdom, love, power, imagination, understanding, will, order, zeal, renunciation, life. Each understood not as psychological capacities, but as individual faculties that corrects the individual consciousness to the divine mind from which it proceeds. For Fillmore, consciousness is not a product of the brain. It is the expression of thought through the individual. The brain is the instrument through which this expression occurs in the physical realm, not the source of the consciousness that uses this. Death in Fillmore's framework is not the end of consciousness. It is a withdrawal of consciousness from one mode of expression, the physical body, and its continuation in other modes. Stream number 2, Ernest, Holmes, and religious science. Ernest Holmes founded the religious science movement, later known as the science of mind, in the 1920s. Holmes was perhaps the most philosophically rigorous of the American divine mind thinkers. His major work, The Science of Mind, is a systematic philosophical and theological treatise that engages seriously with idealist philosophy, Vedanta, and the emergence of sciences of his era. Holmes' central metaphysical claim is that there is one life, one mind, one intelligence operating through all of reality. What he called the infinite intelligence or spirit. Individual human consciousness is this one mind expressing through a particular center of individualization. His framework for consciousness and death is explicit. Consciousness does not end at death. The individual expression continues, evolving through, developing, moving through levels of experience while remaining always an expression of the one underlying divine mind. Holmes grounded this not in blind faith, but in what he considered the convergent testimony of every serious contemplative tradition and the logical implications of a coherent metaphysical idealism. Stream number 3, UCTRUTH and divine mind principles. The UCTRUTH tradition represents a contemplative expression of the same metaphysical core, one that engages seriously with current consciousness research, quantum physics, and the neurological finding we examined in episodes 2 and 3. The UCTRUTH framework doesn't ask you to choose between the scientific evidence and the metaphysical framework. It reads them as converging lines of inquiry approaching the same territory from different directions. The hard problem of consciousness, why physical processes give rise to subjective experience at all, is not a problem within the divine mind framework. It is the expected finding of a framework in which consciousness is primary. If consciousness is the ground rather than the product, then of course, physical descriptions leave it out. Physical descriptions are descriptions of the expressions, not of the source. The ND evidence, consciousness functioning in the apparent absence of brain activity, is not a mere anomaly within the divine mind framework. It is exactly what the framework predicts. If the brain is the instrument through which consciousness expresses in ordinary physical conditions, then the cessation of the instrument function does not terminate the consciousness that was using it. The verified perception cases, accurate perception outside the body during clinical death, are not puzzling within the divine mind framework. They are consciousness doing what consciousness does, perceiving, processing, being aware in the absence of the physical instrument that normally mediates that perception. And the framework doesn't prove these findings. The findings don't prove the framework, but they fit together with a coherence that the materialistic alternative cannot match. Point number 5. What the framework says about consciousness. Now, let me state what divine mind framework says about consciousness as precisely as I can. First, consciousness is ontologically primary. This is not a foundational claim. Consciousness, awareness, intelligence, the capacity to know and experience is not something that emerges from matter at sufficient complexity. It is the ground from which matter emerges. The physical universe is not consciousness generating consciousnesses as a byproduct of its complexity. It is consciousnesses expressing itself in physical form. This is the claim that the hard problems most directly support, not proves, supports. If consciousnesses were genuinely a product of physical processes, we would expect some physical description to close the explanatory gap. The fact that no physical description closes it, that the hard problem remains genuinely hard after 30 years of serious work, is consistent with consciousness being the ground rather than the product. Second, individual consciousness is a particularization of universal consciousness. The divine mind framework does not claim that individual human minds are separate entities that happens to share some properties with a universal mind. It claims something stronger. Individual consciousness is the one consciousness, the divine mind expressing itself through a particular center of individualization. The analogy that Holmes used, a wave, is not separate from the ocean. It is the ocean moving in a particular way, taking particular form, expressing at a particular location. The wave is real. The wave has a specific character, a specific size, a specific motion, but it is not something other than the ocean. It is the ocean being a wave. Individual consciousness is not something other than divine mind. It is the divine mind being a particular person, having a particular history, a particular body, a particular set of experiences. This claim has direct implications for what death is. The wave doesn't die when it subsides. It returns to what it always was, the ocean. The individual consciousness does not end when the physical expression ceases. It returns to, or more precisely, recognizes itself as it has always been, the universal consciousness from which it was individualized. Third, the body is an instrument of consciousness, not its source. The brain and the nervous system are the physical instruments through which the divine mind expresses in the material realm. This is why brain functions correlate with conscious experience. This is why brain damage produces change in conscious capacity. The instrument has been altered. The consciousness using the instrument is not the instrument itself. The piano analogy in episode 2 is the analogy of divine mind tradition has been used since Fillmore. Damage the piano and the music changes are stopped, but the musician is not the piano. This is not a claim that the brain is irrelevant to consciousness. It is a claim about the direction of the relationship. Consciousness uses the brain. The brain does not produce consciousness. Fourth, death is a transition in the mode of expression, not in the termination of consciousness. If individual consciousness is a particularization of the divine mind, if it is the one consciousness expressing through a particular center, then the cessation of the physical instrument through which that expression has been occurring does not terminate the consciousness. It terminates the particular mode of expression. So what follows that termination? What a continuation of consciousness look like outside the physical instrument. The divine mind tradition described in various ways. The Holmes speaks of ongoing evolution through different planes of expression. Fillmore speaks of the 12 powers continuing to develop beyond the physical. And UCTRUTH speak of consciousness continuing its unfoldment with the divine mind from which it was never truly separate. The specific descriptions differ in detail, but the core claim is consistent. Consciousness continues because consciousness was never the body. It was always the divine mind expression through the body. And the divine mind does not end. Point number 6, where it converges with the evidence. Now, let me be specific about where the divine mind framework converges with the evidence in episodes 1 through 3. I want to be precise about what convergence means and doesn't mean. Convergence means the framework and the evidence are consistent with each other, that the evidence makes sense within the framework, and that the framework is not contradicted by the evidence. Convergent does not mean the evidence proves the framework. It does not mean the framework is the only possible interpretation of the evidence. It means the two fit together without requiring either to be distorted. The hard problem. The hard problem why physical processes give rise to subjective experience at all is generally hard within the materialistic framework. It has no satisfactory answer after 30 years of serious work. Within the divine mind framework, the hard problem dissolved rather than being solved. If consciousness is primary, if awareness is the ground rather than the product, then the question of why physical processes give rise to experience doesn't arise. Physical processes don't give rise to experience. They are expressions of a consciousness that was already there. This is not a solved problem. It is a reframing that removes the problem by challenging the assumption that generates it. Let's look at the quantum measurement problem. The observer dependence of quantum reality, the fact that observation participates in producing physical outcome at the quantum level, is deeply puzzling within the materialistic framework. If consciousness is a product of the physical world, how can the act of observation participate in producing the physical outcomes being observed? Within the divine mind framework, this is the expected finding. If consciousness is primary, if the physical world is an expression of mind rather than a source of mind, then the participation of the observer in the observed outcome is not a puzzle. It is a consequence. The NDE verified perception cases. Accurate perception of the external physical environment from outside the body during clinical death. This is the most direct evidence challenge to the materialistic framework. Within the divine mind framework, these cases are exactly what the framework predicts. If consciousness uses the body as its instrument of expression rather than produced by it, then the cessation of the body's function removes the instrument, but not the consciousness. And the consciousness, with its physical instrument, can still perceive through whatever means are available to consciousness in that condition. This is not an explanation of how the perception occurs in those cases. It's a framework within which the perception occurring is not surprising. My own experience. 3 months in a coma. Physician conversations recalled from the unconscious state. Within the materialistic framework, this is an anomaly requiring conventional explanation. None of the conventional explanation, oxygen depreciation, residual activity, post hoc reconstruction, adequately accounts for it. Within the divine mind framework, it is not an anomaly. It is consciousness continuing to function in the absence of normal physical instrument operation, perceiving, processing, being aware without the brain doing what it normally does to mediate that awareness. It is the wave continuing to be water even when it is no longer taking the form of the wave. Point number 7, where it goes beyond the evidence. Intellectual honesty requires equal clarity about where divine mind framework goes beyond what the evidence establishes, because it does. The survival claim. The evidence from episode 1, 2, 3 establishes that consciousness appears to function in the apparent absence of brain activity. It establishes that this functioning includes accurate perceptions of the external environment. It establishes that these findings resist conventional explanation. What it does not establish is what happens to consciousness after physical death in the long term, whether it persists indefinitely, what form that persistence takes, whether it evolves or develops, whether it returns individual identity or merges with a universal ground. The divine mind framework makes specific claims about all of these. Claims rooted in the tradition's theological and philosophical commitments. These claims go significantly beyond what the empirical evidence establishes. This is not a criticism of the framework. All serious frameworks make claims beyond what the immediate evidence establishes. That is what frameworks do. They provide a coherent account of a larger territory than the evidence directly maps. But the distinction between what the evidence shows and what the framework claims is not one I'm committed to maintaining in this series. The nature of divine mind itself, the claim that there is one universal consciousness, one divine mind from which all individual consciousness proceed, is a metaphysical and theological claim. It is coherent. It is philosophically sophisticated. It is consistent with the NDE evidence and the quantum findings and the hard problem. It is not established by them. The evidence is consistent with this claim. It is also consistent with other claims that consciousness is a feature of quantum reality without being universal in the theological sense, for example, or that consciousness persists post-death without there being a single divine ground from which it proceeds. The evidence undermines the metaphysical conclusion. The divine mind framework is my best current understanding of what the evidence, my experience, and the serious contemplative traditions all point together. It is not only the framework consistent with the evidence. I hold it with a conviction that comes from living inside it for decades and finding it adequate. I found it without the certainty that these would close the inquiry. Those two things, conviction and openness, are both necessary for the honest engagement within this territory. Point number 8, the personal witness. I want to say something about how the divine mind framework came to me personally. Not through reading it, through experience first. At 7 years old, in that coma, I didn't have a framework for what was happening. I was 7. I had no theological tradition for understanding 3 months of consciousness existing outside the body with no measurable brain activity. I had no metaphysical vocabulary for physician conversation recalled from the unconscious state. I had the experience without a framework. And for years, the experience sat in me without adequate language, without a container large enough to hold it without distorting it. I tried the available containers, the conventional materialistic account. It was a hallucination, a brain event, nothing real. That container was too small. It required me to dismiss the most significant experience of my life as a noise. The simple supernatural account, God did a miracle, and that's all. Don't analyze it. That container didn't fill either. Not because I disbelieve in divine action, but because it closed the inquiry rather than opening it. It said, stop asking what this means. I couldn't stop asking what this means. The divine mind framework encountered through UCTRUTH, through Fillmore, through Holmes, through the broader metaphysical traditions, was the first container I found that was large enough to hold the experience without distorting it. Not because it explains everything, it doesn't. Because it took the experience seriously as evidence of something real about the nature of consciousness because it placed the experience within a coherent account of what consciousness is and how it relates to the physical world, because it gave me vocabulary to adequately to do what I had lived. That is what a good framework does. It doesn't close the inquiry. It gives the inquirer a structure within which it can go deeper rather than spinning in circles. The divine mind tradition has given me 54 years of going deeper. That is not proof of the framework's truth. It's a testimony to its accuracy, and I offer it as that testimony, not proof to anyone who's building their own framework for what they have experienced or what the evidence suggests. Find the framework that is large enough to hold the truth of your experience without forcing it into a shape it doesn't fit. That is not the standard. The divine mind tradition meets it for me. Now let me close. This episode has covered significant ground. We established why frameworks are necessary because evidence doesn't interpret itself, and everyone who thinks seriously about consciousness is already working within a framework, whether they acknowledge it or not. We surveyed the divine mind tradition, Fillmore, Holmes, UCTRUTH, as a serious philosophical and theological lineage with a coherent metaphysical core. We examined what the framework claims about consciousness, that it is primary, that individual consciousness is a particularization of universal consciousness, that the body is the instrument, not the source, that death is a transition, not a termination. We located where the framework converges with the evidence, the hard problem, the quantum measurement finding, and the verified perception cases. And we were honest about where the framework goes beyond the evidence, the long-term survival claim, and the nature of the divine mind itself. That honesty is not a weakness of the framework. It is a sign of a framework being held correctly. Every serious tradition, scientific, philosophical, theological, make claims beyond its immediate evidence base. The materialistic framework does. The survival hypothesis does. The divine mind tradition does. The question is not whether a framework makes claims beyond its evidence. The question is whether it is held within the intellectual honesty to distinguish what it knows from what it believes, what it has established from what it is reaching toward. I have tried to model that honesty in this episode, not because it's comfortable, it isn't always, because it is the only kind of inquiry worth having about questions this significant. Next in this series, what ancient tradition independently map about consciousness: the Vedantic account, the Taoist account, the Sufi account, the Kabbalistic account, 5 maps drawn without access to each other, pointing at the same territory. What does convergence mean and what it suggests about the nature of consciousness? Link above. Take care of yourself.